have been involved on the project for the concession of the two airports of Larnaca and Paphos since 2001, in fact. At the time it was the launching of the tender process organized by the government of Cyprus. I was in fact working, and I'm still working for a company called Bouygues Bâtiment International, which is one of the main shareholders of Hermès Airport, which is currently operating the two airports. At the time I was the general counsel of Bouygues Bâtiment International, and I was mainly in charge of negotiating the terms of the concession agreement and all the sides agreements which were to be signed to reach the closing of the transaction. That was a difficult exercise because it has lasted almost 5 years from the start of the tender process to the closing of the transaction, which occurred in May 2006. I remember quite well because it was a very long process, and we have been spending the last weeks spending time with the law firms and the lawyers in London to make sure that the, 3,000 pages of the transaction documentation was signed. So it was a difficult exercise, but it has been properly managed by the government of Cyprus at the time. They have been recruiting some very good legal advisors and very good transaction advisors to make sure that the transaction is closed. We have been raising 600 million euros of private financing, so it was one of the biggest transactions at the time. So yeah, a little bit complicated, but with the contribution of the government of Cyprus, with the advisors that have been involving in the transaction, we eventually managed to close the transaction in May 2006. Yes, Hermès Airport is managing the two airports of Larnaca and Paphos now for almost 20 years. It will be 20 years, by the way, next year. So we managed to increase the traffic at the airport from 6 million pax to a record of last year of 12 million pax. Why it worked so well? I think it worked well because there was a clear understanding of what the public sector, so the government, was supposed to do and what the private sector was supposed to do. So basically, the government has relied on the fact that Hermès Airport, together with his partner, will be able to develop the traffic, increase the commercial revenues. And of course, this is what has been happening. You may know that Hermès Airport is comprising several shareholders, including operators, which have been there for the purpose of bringing new airline at the airport. And of course, recently we have been able to bring some new airlines also from the low-cost carriers. And also, and it has been a big achievement, we have been able to increase very significantly the commercial revenues at the airport. You know that the revenues at an airport are mainly coming from the regulated charges which are payable by the airlines, but also the commercial revenues are more and more important in the revenues of the airport. So what has been successful, I think, is the fact that there has been a true collaboration between the government and the private sector. The private sector has been able to bring his know-how, has been able to increase the revenues, and the public sector has been there when Hermès has been facing some difficulties. As you know, over the last 20 years, we have been facing several problems, the last of them being the COVID-19, being the war in Ukraine. You know that the war in Ukraine has led some embargo decision taken against Russia, and of course Russian tourism was a big part of the revenues at the airport of Cyprus. So it has been something that we had to face. And each time we have been facing some problems of this nature, very significant problems, the public sector has been there to help Hermès going through this difficult period. And over the time, I think we have been properly sharing the benefit of what has been happening at Hermès Airport. The government has been receiving a significant remuneration through the 33% of the revenues of Hermès, which are paid every year to the government of Cyprus. And of course, the fact that the tourism has increased from 5 or 6 million pax to today 12 million pax has significantly increased the revenues of the country. So that's the benefit of the country. For Hermès investors, the return on investment is satisfactory. The revenues, again, at the airport are reasonably good. Today we are developing a second phase, and with the fact that the revenues at the airport are good, we have been able to raise another 200 million euro of additional investment to do the phase 2 works. So this shows that the cash flow generated by the airports are satisfactory and are benefiting both to the public sector and to the private sector. I'm not sure I will do a lot of things differently. I think the way the transaction has been structured by the government of Cyprus is perfectly appropriate, it's very professional, and it's well balanced between the interest of the private sector and the interest of the public sector. So what we have learned, and this is something we know very well, if one of the two partners want to have 100% of the benefit of the transaction, it will not work. If it is the private sector, it will not work, for sure, because the public sector is giving the management of a public asset to private investors, so you have to have a fair return for the government. The public sector has to be supporting the private sector in case we are facing some events which were unforeseeable at the time of the closing the transaction. So that's very key to make sure that the parties involved in the PPP contract understand that the only way to make it successful is that it will be a win-win situation for the two partners. Again, in PPP, one of the P stands for partnership. And this is the spirit of what has to be implemented in all PPP projects. If it is not a partnership, then for sure it will fail. So I would say that the concession of Hermes Airport has been a success because we have been constantly implementing this partnership spirit in the relationship between Hermes Airport and the government of Cyprus. Well, the market, the PPP market is facing several challenges. One of them being led to the fact that when you talk about concession scheme, where the revenues are coming from the operation of the asset, the revenues are not coming from payment made by the government. Here at the airport, the revenues are coming from the users at the airport. The business at the airport can face different problems. And over the last years, we have been facing, and Hermes has been facing, and the market has been facing a lot of problems. One of the problems, of course, is the COVID-19. At the time we had, in 2006, when we negotiated the contract, we had a clause dealing with what we call force majeure, this typical clause that you put in a contract, but you normally expect that you will never use it. But here we have been using this clause, and there was a mechanism in the contract to defer the amount of money which was payable to the government in case we would be facing a situation like the COVID-19. But the COVID-19 has been a big shock for Hermes, because of course suddenly the traffic has dropped by 90%. So of course, if the traffic dropped by 90%, then there is no more revenues. Fortunately, the government has been supporting Hermes to go through this period, but without the support of the government, most probably Hermes will not have survived this COVID-19. Now we are facing another event, which is the war in Ukraine, and of course it has also affected significantly the traffic at the airport of Larnaca and Paphos. Another thing that we are facing today is the construction cost. When we signed the contract in 2006, the contractor, so the Bouygues Group, which is one of the largest construction companies in the world, committed on what we call a lump sum price, which is basically a fixed price for the execution of the project. Today, there are events happening which may lead contractors not to agree to commit on a fixed lump sum price. Inflation has been there for the last 3-4 years, and it has significantly affected the cost of construction. Now we see what is happening in the US. When you see that there might be a commercial war between Europe and the US about custom duties, that may affect the cost of construction. So that's a challenge, because normally when you raise the financing of a project like Hermès Airport, which is again 600 million euro for the phase 1, and now we're talking about 200 million euro for the phase 2, you need to have somebody committing on the construction cost. And now more and more, the contractors are a bit reluctant to commit on a fixed lump sum price. And this is challenging, because then you need to deal with the risk, which is what's happened in case of what we call construction cost overrun. So that's something which is to be taken into account. And of course, there are some solutions. Recently, the Bouygues Group has been closing an airport transaction in France for the airport of Beauvais, where we have been addressing this matter by setting an amount of money available to cover this risk. There are other challenges which are, of course, important to deal with. One of them being the carbon footprint of airports. Of course, we need to make sure that in the design of the airport that we are supposed to build during the construction, and of course for the operation of the airport, we are able to improve the carbon footprint of the business at the airport. It's very important, and of course there will be more and more some requirements from the various governments, from the various stakeholders, from the people, to make sure that the environmental aspects of building an airport and operating an airport are properly taken into account. Those are very significant challenges. What may affect the operation, what may affect the revenues, what may affect the construction cost, and how to cover those risks. And of course, making sure that these assets are environmental friendly, and to improve the situation in terms of carbon footprint. These are the main challenges that I think we'll be facing in the coming years. What are the key ingredients to make a PPP transaction a success? For me, it's very simple. I've seen a lot of transactions which have collapsed because the public sector has been trying to put on the market something which is not what we call bankable. The purpose of a PPP project is to raise private financing. Private financing coming from investors, private financing coming from banks, lenders. The banks, they want to make sure that they will be reimbursed for the money that they are lending to the project, and of course the investors are expecting that they will get some return for the investment they are making in the project. The project has to be structured in a way which is understandable for the investors and for the banks, which means that it has to look like the way the other transactions are done in other places in the world. There are PPP happening now in the US, there are a lot of PPP happening in Canada, there are PPP happening in Australia, there are less PPP in Europe, but still there are some PPPs. All those PPPs have some sort of common understanding of the allocation of risk between the private sector and the public sector. If the government launching the tender wants to implement another allocation of the risk, then most probably it will not work, because the investors will not be happy to invest and the lenders will be extremely reluctant to lend some money to finance the project. So the only way to make sure that this is properly structured is to make sure that from the outset, proper and professional advisors are appointed by the government to advise them. It means that the government has to appoint a good transaction advisor to advise them about the financial aspect of the transaction. They've got to appoint a very good international legal advisor, because eventually what will be, I would say, the security of the lenders and the security of the investors, but mainly of the lenders, will be the contract. Because as you know, in a PPP transaction, the ownership of the asset rests with the public sector. So the private investors and the lenders don't have any ownership on the asset which is being built. So good legal advisors for the government are very key to make sure that the PPP contract, concession agreement, whatever is the name of the transaction, the main transaction document are structured in a way which is bankable. Again, I repeat myself, it's bankable. And of course, you need to have on board also a good technical advisor to make sure that the design of the project is something which corresponds to the expectation of the government and the public sector, because you know that at the end of the concession period, the asset is supposed to go back to the government. So it's absolutely key. I've been seeing a lot of PPP transactions failing because of the fact that the government has been trying to put on the market something not being bankable, because something which is not in line with the expectation of the market in terms of allocation of risk and in terms of contract or financing structure. So that's absolutely key. If you got proper advisors advising the government, then the government will be able to put on the market a transaction which will be bankable. There is still a lot of appetite from the private sector to invest in a PPP project. We see even more and more transactions now happening in the defense sector. There will be a lot of investment, as you most probably know, in the defense sector in the coming years, and some of them are financed through a PPP solution. So again, those transactions will be successful only in case the government and the public sector is able to put in place transactions which are, again, bankable.